So I've always had a small fascination for animation. I've tried initially doing it with some of my videos, starting with using just very simple PNG diagrams where I would just lay on top of my videos in order to explain simple concepts such as the whole carpal pedal spasm video. Ultimately, my goal was to be able to make sort of more lifelike animations. I personally think that the best way for me to implement these animations for whatever use I have is to try to learn to use them for making animations that explain medical concepts or human anatomy, because I think that's somewhere where I can actually most productively use these skills of animation rather than just animating random things. So today is one of the days when I try to learn something from scratch. There's this application which I'm about to download called Blender. This is a open source free software which is one of the most well-known to make very cool and realistic animations, which I'm going to try and learn from scratch. Every time I try and learn a new piece of software, there's always a bit of intimidation with a lot of these video editing or photo editing or animating apps. They often have so many different specific functions and features and buttons and shortcuts and hotkeys that can be very overwhelming for people who are not used to it. But because I am back home at almost around 2 p.m, I'm going to try to make this afternoon as productive as possible and really try to get some of the basics down, and let's see how that goes. I've just had Blender downloaded and I haven't touched it at all. I'm going to try and learn how to use this application the same way I did with other ones, just by looking for the right YouTube videos. I have heard before that what every learner has to do when they first get on Blender is try to make a donut. And the first thing that I found on YouTube is a donut tutorial with 9.6 million views, so it sounds pretty trustworthy for me to go try and watch and go through that video myself. And this is what I'll be spending the whole afternoon doing. Alright, so you just saw a very quick time lapse, but that has actually been 3 hours of non-stop watching YouTube tutorials and trying to use Blender. I just stopped at around 2 hours and 50 minutes because my brain is pretty fried from trying to follow all these instructions on the video, and this app is actually so powerful but at the same time so overwhelming. If I show you the first ever video for part 1, it actually has 9.6 million views, and now that I'm at part 2 it's down to 1 million, which sort of just shows how many people have given up since the first part, which is what this comment is saying, which is quite cool. I've persevered to part level 2 within the span of 3 hours. And I'm very glad at what I've been able to make. So we're basically making the simple donut, which is a lot more complicated than it seems. You first have to learn to make a ring, but then in order to make it into a realistic donut, it has to have all those imperfections that you have to learn to do in order to modify them. So you shape them and sort of create imperfections for it to look better. And then you have to learn how to make this layer of icing and how to make sure this layer of icing sort of glosses neatly over the surface of the donut, which I haven't done well. As you can see, it's just a huge gap between the icing and the donut, and I haven't really been able to fix it, but I can't be asked through to this bit again, so I'll figure it out in the future. Then, of course, easy storage, even to change your camera angle. So it's actually such a powerful piece of software, and I really look forward to the day that I can put this into practical use rather than just messing around and creating shapes. I do think though, for my purposes, if I'm trying to make medical animations, a lot of the stuff in this tutorial may not be the most relevant because I don't have to make things look particularly realistic in terms of the shape, the lighting, and how glossy or shiny the surface looks. And I've already been able to find a place online where I can actually download a human skeleton, which means I don't actually have to create a lot of the bones or other anatomical structures myself. I just have to learn how to manipulate them and turn them into video. But I'm still going to finish this tutorial because it seems quite good at giving me an introduction at what this software is capable of. Hi guys, welcome back. This is already 2 weeks later from where we just left off. I ended up giving up on that tutorial because I realized that the stuff that they were teaching regarding the donut and how to decorate it and make it look real and realistic was not the things that I needed to learn. So I directly went to that online website and downloaded the human anatomy model for me to try and mess around with. And I thought to myself, what would be a good, easy project for me to start with? And that's when I thought of trying to make a video explaining or demonstrating how an ACL works. We often hear a lot about people having ACL injuries during football or basketball, but nobody really understands exactly what that specific ligament does. So I thought I'd try to make a video demonstration of that. The first thing I did when I imported the human skeleton into Blender was to first get rid of all the other bones and joints that I didn't want to deal with, because the more stuff you have in the app, the laggier it gets and the higher the chance you have of something crashing. And once I've just isolated the femur and the tibia, which are the two bones of which the ligament attaches to, I started with trying to animate the movements which the tibia would produce in order to stretch or strain the ACL ligament. Just to give some background information, the ACL is most stressed in 3 types of movements. One is during knee flexion, because when you flex the knee, the tibia has a tendency to want to pop outwards from the femur, and the ACL is what pulls it back. It also resists internal rotation and any valgus stress. This may seem a bit more complicated for those that don't know much about bone and joint anatomy, but once I make this animation, things should be a lot clearer. As I was trying to demonstrate the movement of these bones, I had to use keyframes to animate and show that these bones were moving relative to each other. This part was actually relatively easy compared to manipulating a ligament, because with all the animations I did before, this just involved using the transform function, which allows me to move the objects throughout the 3D space and add keyframes so that it could naturally move from one point to the other. This was stuff that I used to already be able to do on Final Cut Pro or the other editing apps that I've used. And as you can see from this first example, the bones are moving very smoothly and moving very well, and there don't seem to be many problems. And you can also get a tiny peek of the ligament inside the knee joint. If you look at it closely, it doesn't look like that ligament is really being pulled or stretched as the bone is being moved. So this came the hard part of this whole process of making this animation, because I didn't have any experience manipulating objects' shape. My prior experience only taught me how to move things, but not how to bend and stretch things. And this is where I had to learn to pick up a lot more skills. I also went on YouTube to try to look for tutorials that could help me with this, but I found that most of the animations on Blender are really made for movies or cartoons, and therefore not really used to explain real-life anatomical or processes, or at least there weren't many tutorials for those. So I ended up having to watch a lot of basic tutorials that taught me what specific functions and specific features that Blender has, rather than being able to directly find the perfect tutorial to teach me how to shape and manipulate a ligament. And one of the first ideas I had was to use the cloth function. So the cloth function is sort of a physical property that you can add to objects inside of Blender. As the name suggests, it causes the object to be converted into a cloth-like material, meaning that it would bend to gravity and flop around just like a real piece of cloth would. This is one of the first things I wanted to try with the ACL, because I wanted the ACL to look as real as possible. I was hoping that using this cloth animation would simulate the effects of gravity on the ACL, allowing it to sort of drop down if it's loose, or be pulled tight if there's force applied onto it. But long story short, if you look at this animation, there is just something off about trying to use this as a piece of cloth. I think if I really wanted to use this method to animate the ACL, I would need to be much more proficient at using and understanding this function in order for me to be able to get those desired results. By this point, I had spent around 3 hours trying to learn that donut, which I ended up not really wanting to complete. And then I also spent probably another 5 hours trying to figure out how to get this ligament to behave as a piece of cloth. And this was when I started to feel a bit frustrated, because I really couldn't think of how to get the ligament to behave the way I wanted it to. The whole point of this animation is that I want to be able to really clearly explain and teach people what the ligament does inside the joint. So in order for me to do that, I had to make sure that the animation was most close to what it is like in real life, in order for people to actually understand and make sense of what's going on. A few days later, I chanced upon another YouTube channel called Ortho Films on YouTube. They made animations specific to orthopedic and made them so clearly that I knew instantly that this is what I wanted to learn to be able to make, and this is the person I wanted to learn from, because there aren't many people that, or any other person that makes this type of animation. So I decided to track down and find the contact this person. I found this Facebook page, and I just ended up sending him a code message telling him, I'm also really interested in orthopedics, I want to learn animation, and could you guide me towards the right direction? He was able to give me some tips, and he also mentioned that it does take up a lot of time, so he wasn't sure if I was able to put as much time in as he did to be able to make that quality of orthopedic animations. Unfortunately, he was quite busy, even though he was happy to give me a couple Zoom lessons if we had the time. But he was actually able to give me some tips that were exactly what I needed to solve this problem of animating the ligament. Despite me having this very, very useful tip, I still ran into a lot of troubleshooting problems where just small little bits would suddenly stop working, or I couldn't find the right key on the keyboard. And there were just still so many obstacles along the way, which ended up making me having to go back and watch a lot of tutorials, sometimes watching those videos many times over just to find out one specific click that they've made so that I can copy what they've done. And it ended up taking probably another 7 hours on a Saturday to finally get the ligament to behave that way. After all of this trouble that I went through, this was the first proper demo that I made. Just a quick disclaimer, right after I made this animation, I knew that although the animation looked a lot better, that didn't really explain the function of the ACL and the way it interacts with the bones in the way that I wanted to. But this wasn't as big of a problem, because I knew I just had to rethink how I wanted this whole animation to play out. But as long as I had the skills to turn that idea into what I had in my mind, I was very happy with this first demo. On the next day, I decided I would try to refine the different camera angles and the little things that I had from my first proper demo, and I ended up making this. So in conclusion, although this was a lot of trouble for me to go through in order to learn to make this specific animation, it was because of all this repetitiveness of me having to try the same little thing over and over again that gradually helped me build a muscle memory and general memory of how things work and how to get them to look a certain way, that I would call myself relatively proficient at making this type of animation from now on. So I don't think in the future, if I make other animations, that it would take me nearly as much as I did the first time around. because the first animation from the day I started making that donut to when I actually got my first demo done was probably around 12 hours. But the next day when I tried redoing the whole thing from scratch, that whole process probably took around 4 hours only. So I knew I just had to get through the hardest bit, learning the basics of the new application and just getting myself set up and ready to be able to use this in the future when I have proper projects that come up. And I guess the biggest takeaway I have was to not be afraid to just contact people that you think are good and see if they're willing to help, because you never know if the other person is nice, and if they are, then they'll just be happy to help you for free and you will be very grateful towards them as well. So that's about it for this video. I look forward to future projects where I can hopefully make a lot of cool animations that are educational, and I think this is a space where there is a lot of room to expand in, because not many people who have a good knowledge of human anatomy also have the skills to be able to make this, and I hope that something more can come out of this. So thank you for watching this video. I've got some other videos if you want to check them out as well, and I'll see you next week for the next one.